Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. One of my favorite Bob Dylan songs from Oh Mercy, one of his great albums, is called Dignity. It begins, fat man looking in a blade of steel, thin man looking at his last meal, hollow man looking in a cotton field for dignity. It's classically jarring in that Dylan way. And it ends by talking about photography. Someone showed me a picture and I just laughed. Dignity, never been photographed. But I think my guest today might disagree. Leah Upi is a very distinguished writer, political philosopher. She has a new book out on her grandmother. It's called Indignity, A Life Reimagined. And it's built around a photograph, a rather glamorous one of her grandmother and grandfather in the Italian Alps, sitting in a couple of deck chairs in 1941 of all time. So I'm not sure whether dignity can or can't be photographed. Leah, what do you think of this? What's the relationship between photography and dignity?
Well, I guess it can't quite be photographed, but insofar as photography conveys memories, and memories are connected with people we know and people carry dignity, then maybe indirectly there is a way of linking photography and dignity. And maybe there is a way in which some photographs try to convey a certain dignitas and a certain way of carrying yourself. And so.
Well, we should note, of course, that your new book, which is this remarkable story of your grandmother. Your grandmother was born in Salonique and then went to Albania. It's called Indignity rather than Dignity. So this photo seems rather dignified. She looks very glamorous and she was a remarkable woman. Why did you choose the word indignity for the book?
Well, there is one understanding of dignity, which is about pose and composure and carrying yourself in a certain way and looking a certain way. And I suppose that is what one might call a dignified photograph. But I actually always thought of dignity as immaterial quality, as something that you can't quite see and you don't really get a lot of empirical traces of it. It's connected more to our will and to morality, to being a certain way, to following certain imperatives. And I called the book Indignity because for me, dignity is always an ideal. It's an ideal that goes with a certain way of thinking about the human. And that is an idealized way of thinking about the human. And I don't think we really see the human with dignity. Most of the time we see manifestations of indignity or efforts to appropriate dignity or to manipulate it or to convince people that now this or that political project is what really gives dignity to the people. And so in that sense, I think I rather like that line from the Bob Dylan song, which also conveys this idea that dignity is quite hard to.
Yeah, someone showed me a picture and I just laughed. Dignity never been photographed, or
well,
maybe
yeah.
Indignity. He should have said indignity. You can photograph.
Well, in a way, I think the meaning of dignity has never been photographed is that all we see is actually indignity, and in particular, political, historical circumstances, like the books, like the ones that I try to trace in the book, but also not unlike the ones that we live in now. Actually, most of what we see and most of what is photographed is indignity rather than dignity. So I wanted to somehow convey this tension between dignity and indignity, whereby indignity is what the world reveals and dignity is what we're chasing and what we're pursuing, what we're trying to find.
And you begin the book with a quote from Immanuel Kant. I know you called yourself in some ways a Kantian. In the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. Is there, in that quote, what does a kingdom of ends mean? Does that suggest that we have to liberate ourselves, so to speak, from a kingdom of ends if we're to get beyond dignity?
Well, I think the kingdom of ends is a metaphor for thinking of a world in which humans relate to each other as moral equals, in which we think of the human as a being that is capable of moral agency, that follows moral imperatives, that acts in accordance with a certain moral conception of duty. And it's called the kingdom of ends because what would result from all of us doing this is a sort of kingdom in which we relate to each other as ends in themselves rather than as only as means. And famously, Kant's formulation was that morality, one of the formulations of what it means to act morally, is to treat other people not just as means, but also always as ends in themselves. And the kingdom of ends is exactly this world, this moral world, this synthesis of virtue and happiness, where we treat each other as ends in themselves and not just as means. So it's rather quite different from what we are actually exposed in our world, where most of the time we treat each other as means, where everything has a price, where everything is commodified. And so it's almost the opposite, the moral opposite of that.
Yeah, and it's not a political book, but your day job is as a political philosopher, you're a progressive. So I'm assuming there is a kind of an anti-capitalist sting in this quote, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a whole strand of early socialists, German socialists, in particular, a guy called Hermann Cohen, who thought that actually Kant was the real founder of German socialism, as opposed to Marx, for example, as the more natural go-to person. And he thought that Kant was the true founder of German socialism because this exact formula that, we should treat other people as ends in themselves is incompatible with a capitalist stance or capitalist attitude, whereby everything is commodified and is considered a means to an end and is traded and exchanged. And so everything has a price, but not really a dignity. So I think there is one tradition of thought that traces a straight line from Kant to the socialist tradition.
And of course, this book is partly about a rather unsophisticated socialism of Enver Hoxha, other Balkan socialists, your grandfather as well, in a way. So there is a political angle. I thought the book was, in some ways, I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be like. It's very hard to pull off a second major book. I mean, your first book, or your first non-political philosophy book, Free, was a massive hit. But in some ways, I think this is actually a better book, or I found it more engaging. You threw more of yourself personally into it. You gave your grandmother, this woman, Lehman Upi, dignity. I mean, that was part of the narrative, isn't it? That was the part of the purpose of this book.
Well, yeah, a lot of the story is actually the search for dignity. And a lot of the question is, what does it mean to think about people who are no longer there, people who are long dead, as people with dignity? And who is in a position to think about the dignity of the dead? And in what form does this dignity survive? I mean, one of the things that struck me is about the reason this book starts with this photo of my grandmother is that it was a photo that came up online in very unusual circumstances. It appeared on the Facebook post of someone I'd never met before. And it was followed by lots of derogatory comments of people making allegations about my grandmother, the fact that she might have been a spy, and why was she smiling in the winter of 1941 when the war was at its most destructive phase. And all of these questions, really, for someone who is not there, who can't explain themselves, who can't defend themselves, who can't, give reasons, raises the question of legacy and the connection of legacy to truth. And for me, a lot of the search, the philosophical question of the book is, in what way and what is the relationship between facts and values in thinking about dignity? And that's why a lot of the book takes the form and oscillates really between non-fiction and fiction, because partly the question that it raises is, if we're thinking about only facts carrying dignity and only facts being able to give us the dignity of a person, that question can be answered depending on how facts are constructed and which authority is in charge of ordering the facts for us. And so there is then a meta search that then asks the question of, well, if you can't trust the archives, if you can't trust the facts, how can you then think about dignity beyond what archives, what historical records, what these lives, what is indignity in the authorities that are out there can give us?
What does Kant say about nostalgia? I mean, I'm not sure if you meant the book to be nostalgic, but it made me, and not that I've lived in Salonika, I'm sure you've read Mark Mazower's book on Salonika, Particularly the beginning of the book is this deep nostalgia for what I think it's your grandmother or her family called Salonique the Magnificent, which is, I guess, in an odd way, the ideal Ottoman melting pot. So what does Kant say about the philosophical value of nostalgia? Is it something he admires or warns against?
I don't think Kant has actually a lot to say about nostalgia. There's only one bit of Kant where I think he goes closer to something like, a reflection on this world that lacks harmony. And that's where he raises the question of how do morality and nature interact with each other. So on the one hand, we have this vision of the human as a moral being that is driven by moral imperatives. On the other hand, we also know that people they have what Kant calls radical evil. So they have also evil motives. They act in nature, they fight each other, they're very selfish, they're not necessarily morally inclined. And really, I think the question at the heart of Kant's philosophy taken as a whole is how can we think about the synthesis between nature and freedom? When the moral being has to act in the real world as we know it, that is polarized and conflictual and driven by injustice, what do we have to believe that it is possible to actually carry yourself with dignity, to realize your moral imperatives? I don't know if it's a question of nostalgia, but it's certainly the question of kind of harmony, which then later, my next quote in the beginning of the book is not from Kant, but from Schiller, who writes about beauty as a second creator.
Yeah, you say it is no mere poetic license, but also philosophical truth to call beauty our second creator.
And that is, I think, that attitude of this sort of subsequent German idealist really goes to the heart of this question of nostalgia for a world where nature and spirit are in harmony with each other, where they're unified, where, you do the moral thing to do, but you're also not in this world that's completely torn, and you want to see some manifestation of morality in the natural world or in the empirical world, as it were. And I mean, the reason I picked this, Schiller has this wonderful poem that really is, I think, a poem for nostalgia called The Gods of Greece, where one of the lines is, "Beautiful world, where are you?" And that is nostalgia for a lost world of unity and of reconciliation. And in the end, it turns out this is very much an ideal world, and the world that we have doesn't give us. But one way in which we can get this harmony is through art. And that's why art has both a nostalgic and utopian features to it. And that's why I sort of went back to Schiller and Kant, because a lot of my book, what it tries to do is navigate this dilemma between the ethic on the one hand, the moral dimension, and the aesthetic on the other. And it asks itself the question of what can a work of art, what can literature, what can the role of a writer as artists do or consist of in bringing this unity, in bringing this lost dignity to the world. And so I think, Kant didn't have a lot to say about nostalgia, but Schiller had a lot. And a lot of what I say in the book is really inspired by Schiller's views on aesthetic education, for example.
Yeah, one of the other books I had, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Bosnian writer Alexander Hemon. He was on the show a couple of years ago. It's his novel, The World and All That It Holds, as a book that presents Sarajevo as a kind of Jerusalem, as the first place that you can't go back to. And that's what Salonika is in the book, although in a weird way you go back to it, but it's not what Salonika was when your grandmother was growing up.
I mean, Salonika, it's interesting you mentioned Jerusalem, because Salonika was for a long time meant to be the Jerusalem as opposed to the Jerusalem that we have now, because it was a predominantly Jewish city. And for a long time, the projects of thinking about, what could be the homeland for the Jews of Europe, for a long time, Salonika was considered that on account of how many Jews there were there and how lively the Jewish traditions were. Actually, the period in which the story begins in 1918, Salonika has just become a Greek city. It became a Greek city in 1912. It was an Ottoman melting pot, city of traders, of consuls, of both political and commercial trade center. And with first with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, first with the annexation to Greece, and then with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the project of Hellenization of the city, and this is something that Mark Merzauer writes really beautifully about in that book that you've just cited, Salonika, this process of Hellenization of the city begins, and with that, also the gradual dismantling of this cosmopolitan multicultural life of the city. my grandmother's life, especially early life, is really a testament to that, because she's born just before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, when the Ottoman Empire was still around, and when somehow one had this idea that these communities could live together, there might be an alternative project or an alternative way of thinking about modernizing the empire or reforming it. And then World War I puts an end to that sort of dream of modernizing the empire. The empire collapses. The Balkans now becomes an area of rising nation states. And in these nation states, nationalism becomes the way to control minorities, to control power, and to assert a kind of nationalist hegemonic project that is at odds with this multicultural life of the city. And groups like Albanians, like Bulgarians, like Armenians. My grandmother was an Albanian who was born in Salonique and who had never been to Albania, but somehow they have to feel like their interests must be aligned with the interests of these rising nation states, in her case, Albania. And that's why at some point she leaves Salonique to go to Albania, because she's told that where she really belongs, even though she's actually never been to Albania before and doesn't quite feel Albanian. But this is a world in which identity is this question of where do you belong, what are you, becomes really, really important in a way that is not the case in the time of the Salonique La Magnifique. And that's why nostalgia, I think, is really nostalgia for a lost time rather than for a lost place or a lost space. It's really a kind of
lost time of the Ottomans. And of course, nationalism by definition is a zero-sum game when it comes to dignity. By embracing your Greekness or Turkishness or Albanianness, you're by definition giving, I guess, a kind of indignity to others. Is that fair?
Yes, because I think it becomes a world in this sort of vision of the nation state. It becomes a world where your place as an individual is the place where you are as part of a collective. So if you're an Albanian, the only way to get dignity is as part of the Albanian new nation state that has just become independent from the empire. And the same thing goes for all the other minorities. So the question of individual dignity can no longer be separated for the question of collective culture and of collective identity, understood in these very nationalist, but also exclusionary and homogenizing terms.
In a way, it's a very sad book. I think at one point, you note that her decision to go back to Albania, to Tirana, by misfortune, ruined her life. So this is not an uplifting story, is it?
No, it's really, I think it only becomes uplifting when you ask yourself the question of what can you learn from these stories? And so what is the use of the past in thinking about the future? It's certainly not an uplifting story if you try to reconstruct the meaning of her life in her terms, in her time, because ultimately it's a life of tragic decisions, all made in the name of, asserting oneself, asserting one's autonomy, separating from these constraints of the time. But then each of these decisions ends up being the wrong decision in the wrong moment in a world that is driven by, first nationalism, then fascism, then communism, where all these ideological projects somehow make claims on the dignity of the people, but also manipulate people's own claims to dignity. So I think the dignity is really, as I say, if there's any space in which it becomes uplifting, in which there's a question of what is the hope, what hope can we take from all this, it's really in this effort to reimagine past lives and to think about the paths not taken and what can we learn when we see history repeating itself. What does it tell us about the truth of our time rather than something to do with the past or with the reconstruction of the past?
Well, I guess the dignity is you. You're there, you're picking up the pieces, you're committed to this woman who you love deeply. There's a degree of guilt because she died when you were studying in Italy. So you came back after she died. So you're giving her a kind of dignity. She was a storyteller, wasn't she? I mean, the way you present her, she wasn't like you. She wasn't really a philosopher. She didn't seem, maybe I got it wrong. She didn't seem particularly political. She told you these remarkable stories. Was it of her grandfather who who died having eaten too much baklava, which is a classic kind of, it could have come out of a magic realism Ottoman novel.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, in many ways, it's about this man, and this story was often told as a way of thinking about the dignity of death and the connection between the dignity of life and the dignity of death, because this was someone to whom people refer to as one of the Sultan's most trusted dignitaries. So he was someone whose dignity was equal to his status, and the meaning of dignity really was the meaning of his status. And yet the idea is with people with that status, with that ranking, with that place in the world, you expect them to also have an equally dignified death. And yet there he's actually he dies from overeating baklava. And there's a question around, can a man who lived such a dignified life, understood in terms of status, have such an undignified death? And what is the connection between the way you live and the way you die? And what is the connection between them? The stories that get told about how we die and the meaning that we ascribe to those past lives that the person themselves can no longer reconstruct. So yeah, I mean, to go back to your question about, she was a storyteller, you're right. And she was, unlike her husband, my grandfather, who was very politically active, who was a social democrat, who was active in the Popular Front in France in the 1930s, and was a social democrat even after he came out of prison. Actually, he was in prison in Albania throughout for 15 years during communism, and remained politically committed.
You're right about him in Free.
Yeah, and he remained a man of the left. Even when he came out, he was quite critical. I remember reading, I never met him, but I remember reading his notebooks where he was taking notes about, the social function of art, and thinking about, Victor Hugo as an emancipatory writer, and writing about Rousseau and the connection between the critique of the social contract that Rousseau presents and contemporary, at his time, the left. And so he was much more explicitly political. I think my grandmother, she had a universal core and a connection to these ideals of the French Revolution, as most of these secular liberal elites of the time had, even in the Ottoman Empire. But I don't think it translated for her into a political program. It was more of a moral renovation program for the individual, for the person.
But she was also remarkably daring. I mean, we're not talking about 2025 now, getting a flight from Salonique to Tirana. She made the journey herself. It was very, I don't know about dangerous, but it was a completely different time, especially during the Second World War. So she was a brave woman in her own way.
Yeah. No, she was very brave. And actually, I remember, I knew her well. I grew up with her. And I remember when I had tried my first cigarette at the age of 15, 16, she told me, oh, I tried mine when I was 14. So this would have been in 1931 or 32 in Salonique. So she was very emancipated. She thought of herself as a very emancipated woman, and a kind of natural feminist, not someone who subscribed to anything feminist in terms of program or platform, but someone whose instincts were naturally to confront patriarchy, in part maybe because of this rebellious character that she had. And so, yeah, when she came to Albania to run away from Salonique, she was completely on her own, and she tried to find a job and was the first woman to work in the Albanian administration.
Yeah, I found a photo with her. This is the first Albanian woman to work in the administration, whatever that means.
Yeah, exactly. Well, she was the first civil servant. The civil service in Albania had just started, and it was all men. And I remember she told me these stories of how she would be the only woman smoking in a crowd of like 40, 50 men who were just coming out of their office in the afternoon and go to a bar and drink cognac. And she was one of them. So, yeah, I think you're right. She was very brave and rebellious.
What do you think she would think about this book? Do you think that there'd be bits of it that would irritate her?
I think, she would understand that the book both is and isn't about her. In a way, a lot of it is based on stories that she told me, and memories and ways of trying to kind of reconstruct her character, and more than her character, maybe even reconstruct her stance in the world. This idea that you remain a moral agent, however adverse the circumstances in which you operate are. She had this idea that even though she had a life of ups and downs, she grew up in a very privileged Ottoman family and then lost everything when she came to Albania and the communists came to power. At that point, she'd lost her money, her status, her family was all left in Greece. And she had this idea that you actually can lose everything, but you don't lose your dignity. And I think she would recognize in the book this effort to reconstruct what does it mean for someone like that to want to remain an agent and to want to remain in control of their fate, even if everything turns against them. But she would also understand that in part it's also a story read from a sort of philosophical perspective. And so she would understand that there is a sort of creative, imaginative license of the author as they piece together not just her life, but all these other lives that are left out of the archives and left out of the records of history, with an effort to reconstruct their meaning from this more moral perspective that actually no factual evidence can fully capture somehow.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. A couple of the characters that really I found memorable was her aunt, who committed suicide because her father forced her to marry a rather unpleasant German. What does that tell us, Leah, about agency? How do you feel about I guess it's your great aunt?
Great aunt Selma. Yeah, I mean, still she's a very important presence in the book. One, as a way of thinking about dignity from this alternative, more Stoic perspective. So it's a sort of philosophical, for me.
Did the Stoics commit suicide?
Oh yeah, the Stoics. It's like it's a paradigm. It's a trope. The Stoic suicide.
Okay.
It's this idea that when nature is against you, when you can't control what happens, when you're at the mercy of these alien forces, as she was, in the case of, it was her mother, actually, not her father, because her father was long dead, but her mother forced her to marry this German businessman to somehow rescue the family fortunes, who were suffering after the Wall Street crash and the financial crisis in 1929 and so on. And the way she asserts her dignity is by just ending life. And there is a trope of, if you think about this Roman, the rape of Lucrezia, for example, this kind of trope of the woman who affirms her dignity by extricating herself from the world and by cutting links with the natural in some ways. And so for me, she plays a really important role philosophically, because it's just a different take on dignity, this dignity as leaving. And there is a sentence that she keeps repeating in the book, which is, when you see a room full of smoke and you're choking, what do? Do you wait for help, or do you just leave? And for the Stoics, this was a metaphor for life. What do? You don't just wait for your life to end naturally. You take control of it and you leave the room, meaning you exit the world. You kill yourself.
Although Lehman could have, Selma could have done what Lehman did and just run away to Albania, couldn't she?
Well, exactly. I mean, I suppose so. This is just another way of thinking, and they both start with these ideas. And she's an important influence on Lehman's life when they start when she's very young.
And one of the striking things as well is that she didn't seem to have much of a relationship with her mother. You sort of you take the mother out. Was she just boring?
Yeah, well, I think the mother was a more conventional housewife, and was doing the kinds of things that housewives were doing at that time. And I think Lehman was more curious and was more educated and really wanted to know more about the world. And this aunt was much more emancipated and forward-looking.
Yeah, and a reader, read books every day.
Yeah, so this is why she was such an important influence. But that's also why Lehman then felt that she was somehow almost betrayed by this aunt. I mean, it took her a long time to understand that she'd killed herself, because she wasn't told immediately. But then when she gets told, she feels almost betrayed, because she thinks, well, if you think of morality not just as something that is for the person, that's very selfish, but also as a relation of moral responsibility, killing yourself is almost cowardly. You're not taking responsibility. You're not thinking about what implications this has for other people. In the case of her, on this young girl who relied on her aunt for everything, and then just feels betrayed and abandoned. And she thinks that, dignity is fighting. And that's what she tries to do throughout her life, is she keeps remembering this lesson of Selma, who, when she found herself in hardship, decided to kill herself. And Lehman thinks almost killing yourself is the easiest thing to do when you're in these circumstances. And if you think about your responsibilities to other people, and actually, incidentally, this is also how Kantians think about.
Yeah, I was thinking Kant didn't approve of suicide, did he?
Kant hated. Kant was completely against suicide, because he felt it was a sort of betrayal of humanity as this relation of moral responsibility, not just the person, what the person does, but more where they fit in relation to other humans. And I think Lehman in the book conveys this stance, and her going back and forth in her imaginary dialogues with Selma are exactly the point is exactly to kind of convey this dilemma of dignity and how you think about the individual vis-a-vis their social responsibilities.
Yeah, and the most memorable scene, I guess, in the book is the wedding that isn't a wedding. Everyone shows up. It's a big party in Salonique, and her German husband, or her imminent husband, walks into her bedroom and finds her dead.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And that's how Selma asserts her agency. And then Lehman kind of keeps thinking about this. And when she's much later in the book, when she's facing similar difficult, she's not forced to marry anyone, but she's in communist Albania. Her husband has been sent to prison. She's constantly humiliated and insulted and has to struggle, is digging a trench. She's a single mother. She's lost everything. And she keeps thinking about this scene with Selma and this question that Selma asked her, what do? Do you leave the room when it's full of smoke, or do you stay? And her answer is, well, you have to stay and fight somehow, even if you don't know how it's going to go. But it would be very selfish and very irresponsible to abandon the struggle somehow.
Although it's not entirely clear always what the struggle is. And the German wannabe husband shows up also with Lehman offering her a way out of Albania, which probably practically couldn't have worked, but it was another memorable scene. So there, the German isn't a particularly attractive guy. He's an entrepreneur. What is he? What's his business?
Tobacco trader.
Yeah. But
because there were very important links between Germany and the Ottoman Empire, and so he's trying to kind of rekindle those links with his trade, with his tobacco business.
But even he wasn't completely evil. I mean, he had some degree of decency, even though there was a moment in the book where I was fearing there was going to be, if not a rape scene, certainly a rather unpleasant sexual experience of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. He's yet another way of thinking about, the book goes back and forth with these different ways of thinking about dignity, and he embodies yet another way of thinking about dignity, which is that it's just ideology, it's just power, and that morality, there is nothing to it. It's just, at some point in this chapter that you mentioned where he comes with an offer for Lehman, the point of that dialogue is that although Lehman is constantly asking him, well, are you feeling guilty? Are you trying to redeem yourself by making me this offer? He's constantly rejecting that. And he says, no, because I don't think of morality in those terms. I think of it as just battering and bargaining. So to him, he's almost the opposite of the Kantian position. Everything literally just has a price and no dignity. And dignity is just a word. It's the morality of slave. It's just a word that
right. He is the ultimate, his kingdom is the one of ends.
Well, yeah, the one of ends that ends up in the ending, not in the, yeah. But absolutely, he's still, I think, and in part, through his character, I also wanted to convey this idea that there is something moral in everyone, even if they don't know it, or even if they don't convey it and they won't accept it. And Lehman is, of course, haunted by her decision to not take his offer of leaving Albania when he offers her, because this decision will have tragic consequences.
Did she talk to you about that?
Oh, yeah, she effectively, she knew that this decision more or less condemned her husband to prison, because if they had left counterfactually, everything would have been different. But then on the other hand, the way she also spoke about this is as a way of, you can't know when you're acting what exactly the consequences of your action will be. You try to stick to the right principle and you make decisions based on the right principle, but you can never know if actually living by those principles will deliver and it will give you happiness, and it might actually increase torment and increase unhappiness, as it did in her case. So yeah, it's also a way of testing the limitations of this argument about being moral and trying to hold on to your agency, because as you say, this then it's much more ambiguous when it works and when it doesn't, and whether it succeeds or not.
Your book, Free, I think, described your very complicated relationship with Albania. You are an accidental Albanian because of your grandmother. How did the writing of this book change your own sense of your own life? I assume in Indignity, maybe implicitly at least, you're also reimagining Leah Upi's life. And now you live in London, you're a famous writer, you teach at the London School of Economics. You've come a long way from Tirana.
Well, I think it made me appreciate perhaps even more the complexity of identity. A lot of this book is about not taking identity for granted and as given, and a lot of it is about deconstructing the narrative frameworks that we are given to think about who we are and identity more generally, and whether this is in the form of the authority of the archive or whether it's in the form of understanding and taking histories for granted. The book is really putting a lot of pressure on this idea that you can take identity as given, and that once you start beneath the surface, you understand that there's a complexity there that comes from historical circumstances and changes in regimes and governments replacing each other and shifting borders. That means that there isn't really an easy answer to this question of what are you? And that made me somehow, I'd always been sympathetic to this way of thinking about identity as sort of complicated, but it was interesting to discover that in my own family, this was certainly the case, and that although I'd always thought of myself as Albanian, thought of my grandmother as Albanian, when you actually go and look at the details of her life, that is yet another label that is just attributed, but it's not necessarily the case. It's much more complicated. And then it also made me then think about this unfortunate politics in which we live, which builds everything on identity, and where minorities are increasingly scapegoated. And this question again of what are you, what is your identity, where is your real country, keeps returning as a way of thinking about how you can solve the problems of the present, where it's obviously a scam and it's obviously a very sort of cynical, hypocritical strategy, because these identities are so complex that you can't force anyone to belong in one place and nowhere else. And yet, as I say, the politics of the present is one where that is the proposition. This, whether it's migration, whether it's deportation, whether it's, people we need to deglobalize and return to this homogenic unity of the nation state, all of these answers are very simplistic answers premised on a very simplistic understanding of identity. And I think I just appreciated that a lot more as I appreciated the echoes of the past in the present when I was writing the book.
A few days ago, we had the American free speech lawyer, Greg Lukianov. He runs FIRE, and he wrote an interesting piece about, or one of his people at his institute, the problem with dignity. When you fetishize dignity, you're really building indignity, aren't you?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It depends on how we understand it, right? So how do we understand delivering dignity, and what are the means? I think there is a sense in which even all politics that promises on delivering dignity needs to be critically questioned and scrutinized. And for me, there isn't one answer, just as there isn't one answer on identity, there isn't one answer on which political project can deliver dignity. But I think there are plausible criticisms of, what is wrong with, for example, the way in which capitalism violates people's dignity, or the way in which nationalism violates people's dignity. So there are possible lines of criticism of existing projects that can take inspiration from this ideal of dignity, living a dignified life, living in a kingdom of ends, and thinking about the institutions under which we live as how well they live up to those ideals and to what extent they betray them.
You do a lot of podcasting with David Runciman. He's been on the show. His new book is The Handover: How We Gave Control of Our Lives to Corporations, States, and AIs. You even did a show with David about this and on dignity and indignity. Do we live particularly, I mean, this isn't really a political manifesto, Leah, but what can we, if David Runciman's right, and we have indeed given up our control of our lives to corporations, states, and AIs, then what does your book about your grandmother, Indignity, what does it tell us?
Well, I guess it tells us, it tells a story about this extent to which we are also in many ways shaped by these agents that are impersonal, or by these structures that of control and surveillance, and often, the digital world takes that form, that are impersonal, and where it's not, you can't say who is oppressing who or who is surveilling what. There isn't an agent. In communist Albania, you would have had a party or a system or a state where you can say this agent is oppressing all these other agents because it's censoring them or it's surveilling them or it's spying on them. And now we live in a world with, in particular, when you think about the sort of digital technology and digital dynamics, where you can't say that there is an agent that's surveilling or controlling us or violating our dignity, but the structure of our interactions is such that everything we do, the holidays we go to, or the conversations we have on the internet, or the things that we buy, everything becomes part of this system that turns that into a means for profit of some powerful people. And you ask yourself, what is my role in this system? And what is the morality of a system that survives just based on that? We're just kind of commodifying, taking this data and turning them into means.
But what does that mean? Should we just not use Facebook or Google?
Well, for me, it's a question of democratic control over these platforms. So I think it's about, having mechanisms of transparency and accountability, and building a critique of those. So it's not even about the technologies themselves, because I think the technologies as such are neutral. So I don't think, I always say that digital technology or AI is like the equivalent of a kitchen knife. You can use the kitchen knife to slice bread, or you can use it to kill other people, and the knife itself is not the problem. The problem is the use of it, the control of it, the mechanisms of accountability. And my concern with the contemporary organization of platforms and ownership structures over these platforms is that they just do not enable value to be discussed. It's just that everything turns into a means for profit. And the further question of the justification of it and the principles behind it is completely abandoned and left. And that is something that I think is really at odds with a certain understanding of human dignity and dignified life.
And finally, Leah, I got the sense of a cathartic element here. You needed to write this book. It wasn't just some whim. You needed to write it. You needed to learn more about your grandmother, what she was doing in Italy in 1941, why she did indeed become, why she became the first Albanian woman to work in the administration. Was this a good project for you? Do you feel you came out of it knowing more about yourself and your family?
I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Salonique. I learned a lot about interwar politics. I learned a lot about, the relation between the past and the present. It was really, really hard to write, in part because of the historical detail that you had to master to be able to even write, even if you write the story in a fictionalized way. I mean, I didn't invent anything. So everything I write, even in the more fictionalized novelistic parts, is based on historical records, on diplomatic documents or letters or memoirs of newspapers of the period. So because everything is backed on research, it was really, really hard. And in different countries, so different archives, I learned Greek to try and read those documents. And
how long did it take?
It was just a
what, 3 or 4 years? Your last book?
Yeah, 4 years. Yeah. I mean, that's basically I'm just glad, as you asked, how did you come out? I'm glad I came. I'm glad I survived it, because it was really,
like your grandmother.
It was really hard to write. Yeah, exactly.
It made you, I assume it made you much closer to her.
It made me. I mean, it certainly made me understand details of her life that I had not really appreciated. When she told me the stories, I hadn't quite understood why this story mattered. She would sometimes talk about, say, the population exchange between Greece and Turkey and how much of an impact this had in her life. And I just never understood as a child, because you can't even get your head around the population exchange. How do you think about displacement, literally, of collectives, from millions of people going from one place to another by a deadline, with all their property and all their stuff and all their livelihood? And when I learned and I read the circumstances in which this came about, and the end of World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, I could really understand why this was such a traumatic event in her life, for example, in ways in which I had not really appreciated. So I don't know that it made my grandmother, I don't think it made me know my grandmother better, but it certainly made me understand the forces, the historical forces that somehow shaped her life much better, this research.
Well, there you have it. Dylan was wrong. Dignity can be photographed. There is a photograph of dignity at the heart of Leah Upe's new book, Indignity, A Life Reimagined. Great stuff, Leah. The book is out on November the 4th. I'm sure it's going to be another big hit. And I'm guessing you're having a break now. You're not going to do another book about your family, are you?
No, I don't know. We'll see. Not about my family. Maybe I'll do a sequel to Free or something. I'll go back to myself.